The paper was delivered on the 4th of October, 1888, a Thursday. The man who brought it was young, with a soft chin and the kind of cheap suit that seemed too tight in the shoulders. His name was Ames, and he worked as a clerk for the Black Ridge Mining Company. He stood on the porch of the small company house, number 11 on the north edge of Gideon's Gulch, and refused to meet Clara Hale's eyes. He held the envelope out as if it were a dead thing. "Mrs. Hale," he began, his voice thin in the high, cold air of 9,200 feet. "This is a formal notice from the company." Clara did not take it immediately. She looked past him, at the sharp, serrated line of the peaks already dusted with the season's first snow. Winter was not coming. It was already here, waiting in the high passes. She was 38 years old, and her husband, Thomas, had been dead for 6 weeks, his body broken in a shaft collapse 1,000 feet below the ground they stood on. She finally took the envelope. Her hands were steady. The paper inside was thick and official. It stated in clear, typed letters that her occupancy of company housing was terminated. The standard grace period of 30 days had been shortened due to the pressing need for housing for new miners arriving before the passes closed. She had 14 days to vacate the premises. At the bottom, a second paragraph outlined the company's final settlement for Thomas's death: $75. It was presented not as an apology or compensation, but as a gesture of goodwill, a final closing of the books. Mr. Ames cleared his throat. "There's a check for the settlement at the main office. You just need to sign a waiver." Clara folded the paper and slipped it into the pocket of her apron. She looked at the clerk now, a direct and unblinking gaze that made him shift his weight from one foot to the other. She did not weep. She did not raise her voice. The shock was a cold, silent thing that settled deep in her bones. A piece of the coming winter lodged inside her. 14 days, she said. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact, like noting the temperature or the time of day. "Yes, ma'am. I'm sorry," he said, though the words carried no weight. He was an instrument, a messenger. The cruelty was not his own. It belonged to the ledgers and the policies written in an office in Denver by men who had never felt the bite of a Gideon's Gulch winter. "And the settlement is $75, she added, her voice just as level. "Yes, ma'am." He seemed eager to leave. He took a half step back toward the porch steps. Clara did not move. She watched him, and in her stillness, he saw something that unnerved him more than shouting would have. He saw a composure that was absolute. He was a young man accustomed to the predictable grief of widows, the loud anger of wronged men. He did not know what to do with this quiet woman, who looked at him as if he were a column of figures in a book, a problem to be assessed. He finally mumbled something about his duties and turned, walking quickly down the path, his boots crunching on the frost-hardened dirt. Clara watched until he was gone. Then she went back inside the house, closing the door softly behind her. The house was Thomas's last gift, filled with the scent of him, of sawdust and pipe tobacco, and the faint metallic tang of the earth he had worked in. In 14 days, that too would be taken from her. She walked to the kitchen table and sat down in the chair Thomas had built. She pulled the notice from her pocket and laid it flat on the worn pine. She read it again, not for emotion, but for information. 14 days, $75. Vacate the premises. The words were simple, administrative, and utterly final. This was the moment the world pivoted. The life she had known was over. A new one, a life of cold calculation, was about to begin. She sat there for a long time as the afternoon sun slanted through the window, the light growing weaker, paler, a preview of the long darkness to come. She did not light the lamp. She sat in the growing dark of the kitchen and performed the grim arithmetic of her own survival. The $75 from the company was a starting point. In a small tin box hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the bedroom, she had her own savings, accumulated over years from selling eggs and mending clothes for the miners. She retrieved it and counted the contents on the table in the faint moonlight. $42.16. Her total capital was $117.16. It felt like a fortune and nothing at all. Her mind worked like a careful accountant, listing her options in a silent ledger. Option 1. Denver. The stagecoach ticket would cost $18, a significant portion of her funds. Once there, a room in a boarding house, if she could find one that would take a woman her age, would be at least $4 a week. Work was the great unknown. She was 38. The laundries, the kitchens, the boarding houses, they hired young women, girls with strong backs, who could work 14-hour days without complaint. They did not hire widows approaching 40, women whose faces were already mapped with grief and hardship. She calculated how long her money might last. 10 weeks? Perhaps 12 if she ate little and found a room in a poor part of the city. 12 weeks would take her to the middle of January, the very heart of winter, at which point she would be destitute in a city of strangers. She drew a line through that option in her mind. It was a slow death sentence. Option 2. Stay in Gideon's Gulch. The town was little more than a company camp. Every house, every business, the general store itself, all existed on land leased from Black Ridge Mining. There was no independent life here. She had no family. Her parents were long dead, buried in a churchyard in Ohio, a place she could no longer imagine. Thomas had been an orphan. They had been a complete world unto themselves, a small, sturdy unit of 2. Now the unit was 1, and it was not viable. She could not rent a room here. There were none to be had that were not owned by the company. She could not work here. The only work was for men in the mine or for young women in the saloon. She was neither. This option, too, was a dead end. There was no third option. The list was complete. She sat at the table and stared at the facts. $117. 14 days until she was homeless. Winter arriving not as a season, but as an invading army. She was a line item in the company's expense report, a minor cost to be cleared from the books. The cruelty of it was not personal. It was systemic, a function of the cold logic of profit and loss. It occurred to her that Thomas had not been killed by falling rock. He had been killed by this same logic, a logic that valued the ore in the ground more than the man who dug it out. She felt no self-pity. The emotion was a luxury she could not afford. Pity would not keep her warm. Pity would not fill her belly. It was a useless, heavy thing. What she needed was a plan, an answer to the equation she had laid out before her. She was a problem to be solved, and the available materials were 1 woman, $117, and the vast, indifferent wilderness that surrounded the town. The scale of it was terrifying, but the clarity was a strange comfort. She knew exactly where she stood. She stood on the edge of a cliff, and the only way to go was forward. She rose from the table, her movements stiff but deliberate. It was time to pack. She would not waste a single hour of her 14 days. She would start with Thomas's things, the pieces of him that remained. It was in his trunk, at the bottom, beneath his spare woolen shirts and the worn copy of Shakespeare he had loved. that she found it. It was a journal, bound in dark brown leather, its pages filled with his neat, precise handwriting. It was not a diary of his feelings, but a log of his observations. Thomas had been more than a miner. He was a self-taught geologist, a student of the earth. He saw the world in layers, in strata, in faults and fissures. He had spent his few free days walking these mountains, not for pleasure alone, but for knowledge. He recorded rock formations, soil types, the flow of water, the way the trees grew differently on a north-facing slope than on a south-facing one. Clara sat on the floor with the journal in her lap, turning the pages carefully. It smelled of him, a faint, clean scent of paper and ink and leather. It was a conversation across the chasm of death. She ran her fingers over his sketches of granite outcrops and limestone deposits, and then she found the entry. It was dated August 12, 1886, more than 2 years ago. The heading read, "Limestone Alcove, South Slope of Unnamed Ridge. Propose Widow's Ridge." His entry was meticulous. While surveying the old Brierson claim, I found a significant geological feature. A natural alcove, or shallow cave, in a massive limestone formation. Approximate dimensions: 20 feet across the mouth, 12 feet deep. Ceiling height tapers from 9 feet at the front to 6 at the back. Most importantly, its orientation is due south, a perfect solar collector. The floor slopes gently outward, ensuring good drainage. A small, reliable spring emerges from the rock approximately 50 yards to the west. The thermal mass of this limestone is extraordinary. Even after sunset, the rock radiates a palpable warmth. It would make a superior winter shelter for a prospector, far better than a canvas tent or crude cabin. With a dry stack wall across the front, it would be almost a house. Below the text was a detailed sketch. He had drawn the shape of the alcove, the slope of the hill, the location of the spring. He had even sketched a hypothetical front wall, with a space marked for a door and another for a small window. He had marked the prevailing wind direction, from the northwest, and shown how the bulk of the ridge would block it completely. The final sentence of the entry was pure Thomas, a simple statement of practical fact that now felt like a prophecy. A man could survive a hard winter there. With proper provision, he could survive it in comfort. Clara closed the journal and held it to her chest. This was her inheritance. Not money, not property, but something far more valuable. Knowledge. A location. A plan. It was as if he had reached through time and given her a key. He had seen this place, and, without knowing her future, had documented its potential with the care and precision he applied to all things. He had prepared a way for her. In the crushing loneliness of the last 6 weeks, she had felt utterly abandoned. But now, holding this book, she understood she was not alone. Thomas was still with her, his intelligence a map she could follow, his voice a quiet instruction in her ear, a flicker of something that felt like hope, fragile but real, ignited in the cold space of her heart. She would go to this place. She would see it with her own eyes. Widow's Ridge. He had named it, and now his widow would make it her home. The next morning, she rose before dawn. She dressed in her sturdiest boots, a woolen skirt, and Thomas's heavy wool coat, which hung loose on her frame but provided a familiar comfort. She packed a small canvas bag with a loaf of bread, a piece of cheese, a canteen of water, and Thomas's journal. She walked out of the silent town as the first light touched the highest peaks, her breath pluming in the frigid air. The directions in the journal were clear: Follow the main creek north for 2 miles, then take the old, overgrown logging trail that branched to the east. The trail would climb for another 2 miles, gaining 800 feet in elevation. The walk was arduous. The logging trail was barely visible, choked with fallen timber and thickets of mountain laurel. She had to push her way through, the sharp branches scratching at her coat. The air grew thinner as she climbed, and her lungs burned with the effort. But the work focused her mind, pushing away the grief and fear, leaving only the task at hand. She consulted the journal, comparing Thomas's sketches of rock formations to the land around her. A granite outcrop shaped like a bear's head, a stand of ancient, twisted bristlecone pines. He had marked them all. She was walking in his footsteps. After 2 hours of steady climbing, she reached the ridge. The trees thinned, and she stepped out onto a slope of scree and sun-bleached grass. The view was immense. The entire valley spread out below her, Gideon's Gulch a tiny gray smudge in the distance. And there, just as he had described, was the massive pale gray wall of limestone, a sheer cliff rising 100 feet from the mountainside. She followed the base of the cliff, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and anxiety. What if it was not as he'd described? What if it was wet or too small, or faced the wrong way? It was hidden, just as he'd implied it would be, tucked behind a screen of gnarled, old-growth juniper. She pushed aside a heavy branch and stopped. It was perfect. It was exactly as he had drawn it. The mouth of the alcove was a wide, graceful arch in the rock, 20 feet across. The floor was covered in a fine, dry dust. The limestone walls were smooth and solid, glowing faintly in the morning sun. She walked inside, her footsteps silent. The air was still and noticeably warmer than the air outside. She looked up at the ceiling, 9 feet high at the entrance, sloping gently down to the back, where she saw the dark line of the fissure he had mentioned, a natural flue. She began a methodical inventory, just as he would have. The interior space was roughly 200 square feet, the size of a small cabin. The floor was dry and sloped correctly for drainage. The southern exposure was absolute. The sun would pour into this space from morning until late afternoon. She stepped outside and found the spring, a steady, clear trickle of water seeping from a crack in the rock and gathering in a small, stone-lined pool. Below the ridge, the south-facing slope was a treasure trove of fallen timber, ponderosa pine and aspen, seasoned and dry, enough firewood for a dozen winters, and everywhere, scattered across the slope, was an abundance of flat, manageable granite stones, scree from the cliffs above, perfect for building. She sat on a flat rock at the mouth of the alcove and ate her bread and cheese, looking out at the world. From here she could see everything. She was above the town, separate from it. The company that had evicted her was a powerless abstraction down below. Here there were only the rock, the sun, the water, and the wood, the fundamental elements of survival. Thomas had not just found a place. He had found a fortress, a piece of geology perfectly engineered for life. She opened the journal to his sketch and laid her hand on the page. "Thank you, Thomas," she whispered to the quiet air. The decision was made. This would be her home. This could work. This could actually work. Her first stop back in Gideon's Gulch was Porter's General Store. Elias Porter was a man of 70, with a fringe of white hair and hands gnarled by arthritis, but his eyes were sharp and missed nothing. He had known Thomas for years, had respected his quiet intelligence and his habit of paying his debts on time. When Clara walked in, a list written in a neat hand on a scrap of paper, He nodded to her from behind the counter. "Mrs. Hale," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I was sorry to hear the news. From the company." Word traveled fast in a town this small. "I have 14 days, Mr. Porter," she said simply. "It's a damn shame," he said, and she knew he meant it. He looked at the list in her hand. "What can I get for you?" She began to read from her list, and as she did, a slow understanding dawned in the old man's eyes. This was not the shopping list of a woman preparing to leave. It was the list of a woman preparing to stay, but not in any way he had imagined. "A good shovel," she began. "That one there. It's $3.50. Is that right?" "It is," he said, pulling it from a barrel. "A pickaxe, the one with the hickory handle, $2.75. "Yes." "A handsaw, a heavy hammer, and a level." He laid them on the counter without a word. The total was $9.75. She paid in coin, her movements precise. Then she moved to provisions. 100 pounds of flour, 50 pounds of pinto beans, 20 pounds of salt pork, 10 pounds of salt, 5 pounds of Arbuckle's coffee. He weighed everything out, his movements methodical. He saw the grim determination in her face. He knew she had no family to go to, no money to speak of. He was watching a woman arming herself for a war against the winter. "And matches," she said. 2 large boxes and candles, and 3 bars of lye soap. Finally, she pointed to the largest item in the store, a small, pot-bellied cast-iron stove sitting in the corner. "The stove, Mr. Porter. How much?" "That's $12, he said softly. "I'll take it, and 20 feet of stovepipe to go with it." That was another $4. He added it to the growing pile of goods. Her last major purchase was a heavy 12 by 15-foot canvas tarp, waterproofed with linseed oil. $6. She was spending her money with surgical precision, buying only what was essential, what would last. When she was finished, the bill came to $59.25. It was more than half of her entire fortune. She counted out the money. As she did, Mr. Porter went into the back room. He returned with a thick gray wool blanket, a small whetstone for sharpening the saw and axe, and a heavy wooden box filled with an assortment of nails, screws, and hinges. He placed them on the counter with her other things. "What do I owe you for these?" Clara asked. "Nothing," he said, his gaze steady. "Thomas was a good man. He settled his accounts. This one is on the house." Tears pricked at the back of her eyes, the first she had felt since the notice was delivered. It was the simple, unexpected kindness of it. She blinked them away. "Thank you, Elias." "You'll need help getting this hauled," he said, gesturing to the heavy stove and sacks of flour. It was a question disguised as a statement. "I will come for it in pieces," she said. "I can manage." He knew better than to argue. He saw the set of her jaw. "I'll hold it here for you as long as you need," he said. He did not ask where she was going. He did not ask what she was building. He saw her resolve and he respected it. He was a quiet ally, a witness to her impossible plan. And in a world that had declared her disposable, that witness was worth more than any amount of money. The labor began that same afternoon. For the next 10 days, Clara worked from the first light of dawn until the last fading rays of dusk. Her life became a cycle of pure physical effort. The first task was moving her supplies. She could not carry the stove, but she could manage the smaller things. Each day she made 2 trips, hauling 50-pound sacks of flour and beans on her back up the steep trail to the ridge. The 4-mile journey took her nearly 3 hours one way. Her muscles screamed in protest, but with each trip, she grew stronger, her body hardening to the task. She left the heavy stove and tools at Mr. Porter's, the final items to be moved. Once the provisions were secured in the back of the alcove, covered by the canvas tarp, she began the construction of the wall. This was the most grueling work of all. Using the pickaxe, she loosened the flat granite stones from the scree field below the ridge. Each stone weighed between 20 and 50 pounds. She would pry one loose, lift it, and carry it up the slope to the mouth of the cave. Her hands, soft from years of housekeeping, were raw by the end of the first day. By the third, they were covered in a patchwork of blisters and cuts. She ignored the pain, wrapping them in strips of cloth torn from an old shirt. She was not a stonemason, but Thomas had taught her the principles of a dry stack wall. Choose flat stones, overlap the joints, set each stone on at least 2 stones below it. Use smaller stones to fill the gaps and wedge the larger ones tight. Slowly, painstakingly, the wall began to rise. It was a monument to her own endurance. 1 foot high, then 2, then 3. She left a 3-foot opening for the door and a small 2-foot square opening for a window. After a week of relentless hauling and lifting, the wall stood 4 feet high, a solid barrier of gray granite enclosing the front of her new home. Next came the woodwork. She used the handsaw to cut down dead standing pine, limbing the trunks and cutting them into manageable lengths. From these, she framed the door and the window, nailing the rough-hewn timbers directly to the rock where she could, and wetting them into the stonework. She built a simple plank door, fastening the boards together with 2 cross braces. She hung it using the heavy iron hinges Mr. Porter had given her, fashioning a simple wooden latch to secure it from the inside. She stretched the canvas tarp over the window opening, creating a translucent pane that would let in light but keep out the wind. Finally, with the help of Mr. Porter's boy, who agreed to drive his father's wagon as far up the logging trail as it would go for $1, she brought up the stove. Getting it the final half-mile up the steep slope was a battle of leverage and sheer will, but she managed it, sliding it over the rocks on a makeshift sledge of pine branches. She set the stove on a carefully leveled stone platform inside the alcove, 5 feet from the front wall. She fitted the lengths of stovepipe together, running the pipe up and out through a purpose-built channel in her stone wall, sealing the gaps around it with a mixture of mud and small stones. Her last and most vital task was the gathering of firewood. This was not a chore. It was her life insurance. She worked with a feverish intensity, sawing fallen pine and aspen into stove lengths, splitting the larger rounds with the back of her axe and a wooden wedge, and hauling it all up to the shelter. She stacked it along the inside wall of the alcove, a dense, fragrant wall of fuel. She organized it with meticulous care, kindling, small branches, and larger logs, all sorted and stacked so the driest wood would be used first. She did not stop until she had amassed a pile that reached the ceiling and ran the full 12-foot depth of the cave, at least 4 cords, a fortress of firewood that represented warmth, cooked food, and life itself through the coming winter. On the 13th day, she stood back and looked at what she had built. It was not a cave anymore. It was a home, a small stone and timber bastion against the cold. And it was hers. The storm arrived on the 21st of November. It did not come gently. It came as a sudden, violent assault, the sky turning a bruised, metallic gray, and the temperature plummeting 30 degrees in a single afternoon. The wind began to howl out of the northwest, a relentless, shrieking force that scoured the high peaks. Then the snow began, not in flakes, but in a solid, blinding wall of white. Within hours, the world outside Clara's shelter vanished. She was ready. The last of her firewood was stacked, her provisions were organized, and her small home was secure. She latched the plank door, the sound a solid thud against the rising shriek of the wind. The gale hit the massive rock of the ridge and split around it, leaving her alcove in a pocket of relative calm. Her stone wall, only 4 feet high but thick and solid, deflected the gusts that swirled around the edges. Inside, the silence was profound. She lit a candle, its small flame steady in the still air. Then she laid a fire in the stove, a handful of dry pine shavings, a pyramid of kindling, and then 2 small logs of seasoned aspen. The match caught on the first strike. The fire roared to life in the small iron box, and a deep, radiating warmth began to fill the space. She sat on her sleeping pallet, a mattress of pine boughs covered with her wool blanket, and watched the stove begin to glow a faint red. This small, black iron heart was the center of her new world. For the next 7 days, the blizzard raged without pause. The temperature, as measured by a small thermometer Thomas had owned, dropped to 10 below zero, then 20, then held steady at a brutal 25 below. The snow accumulated with terrifying speed. By the second day, it had drifted up over her window. By the third, it had completely buried her door. She was entombed in white. But instead of a prison, the snow became her greatest ally. It was a perfect insulator. She had read in one of Thomas's books that a thick layer of snow could have an R value comparable to straw bale. The heat from her stove, which would have been leached away by the sub-zero air, was now held inside by the thick blanket of snow and reflected back by the immense thermal mass of the limestone walls. She established a strict routine. Each morning, she would add just enough wood to the stove to keep a low, steady fire. She maintained the inside temperature at a consistent and comfortable 55 degrees. Any warmer would be a waste of precious fuel. She kept a careful record of her wood consumption in the margins of Thomas's journal, calculating how many logs it took to keep the temperature steady for a 24-hour period. Her 4 cords of wood, which had seemed like a vast amount, now felt like a precisely measured resource, and her careful management of it was the key to her survival. She cooked her meals on the stovetop, hot oatmeal in the morning, a thick bean soup for supper. The coffee she saved for a small luxury in the afternoon. The days were a quiet rhythm of small, essential tasks: tending the fire, melting snow for water, mending her torn clothes, sharpening her tools with the whetstone. When the snow blocked her door, she used her shovel to dig a narrow tunnel outward. The tunnel was about 10 feet long, ending in a vertical shaft to the surface. This became her new entrance, a passage through the deep snowdrift that further insulated her home. The structure worked. Her engineering, learned from Thomas's journal and her own common sense, was sound. She was not just surviving, she was living, warm and safe, while the worst storm in a generation tried to tear the world apart outside. On the 7th day, she made a simple note in the journal, next to her firewood calculations. "It holds," she wrote. "The shelter holds." When the storm finally broke, the world was remade in white and silence. The snow lay 8 feet deep on level ground, sculpted by the wind into massive drifts against the ridges. The sky was a brilliant, aching blue. Clara emerged from her snow tunnel into a world of blinding light. The air was so cold it felt like a physical blow, but it was still. The valley below was a sea of white, with only the tallest pines and the thin plumes of smoke from the town's chimneys breaking the surface. A few days later, she saw a figure moving slowly up the slope toward her, a dark shape against the snow. It was Elias Porter, making his way on a pair of old-fashioned wooden snowshoes. He carried a burlap sack over his shoulder. He had been worried, he told her when he finally reached the alcove, his breath frosting in the air. He had not expected to find her alive. He followed her down the snow tunnel into her home. He stopped just inside the door, his eyes wide with astonishment. The air was warm and dry, smelling of wood smoke and coffee. He looked at the dry stack wall, the well-fitted door, the glowing stove, the immense, orderly pile of firewood. "My God, Clara," he said, his voice filled with awe. "You're warmer in here than I am in my own house behind the store." He set the sack down. It contained a 5-pound bag of sugar, a small tin of tea, and 2 new novels from a shipment that had arrived just before the storm. "A little something," he said gruffly, "to pass the time." He told her the news from the town. It was grim. The blizzard had been a catastrophe. The company houses, poorly built and drafty, had become iceboxes. Several families had run out of firewood entirely, their green wood piles frozen solid under the snow. There was sickness, coughing, fevers. The company had been unprepared. The mine superintendent hunkered down in his own well-insulated house, offering little help. Mr. Porter's story was the first crack. Word of the widow on the ridge began to spread through the desperate town. A few days after his visit, another figure appeared, a young woman named Sarah, the wife of a miner, pulling a small sled with her sick 4-year-old son bundled in blankets. The boy's cough was a dry, racking sound. Their cabin was freezing, their wood gone. She had heard that Clara was warm. She was desperate. Clara brought them inside without hesitation. She sat the boy near the stove, wrapped him in her own wool blanket, and brewed him a hot, sweet tea with some of the dried mint she had gathered in the fall. She listened to Sarah's story. Then she took her outside and showed her something simple. She showed her how to bank the deep snow against the north and west walls of her cabin, packing it down to create a thick, insulating barrier. "The snow is not your enemy," Clara explained. "You have to use it." She sent Sarah back to town with a bundle of her own dry kindling and a small sack of split pine. "This will get your fire started again," she said. "Then keep it going, no matter what." The woman wept with gratitude. Others followed. An old widower whose hands were too stiff with arthritis to split his frozen logs. A young couple with a newborn baby. They came to her not for charity, but for knowledge. She taught them what she knew. She drew diagrams in the snow with a stick, showing how to build a simple snow wall as a windbreak, how to clear a roof to prevent collapse, how to arrange a woodpile for optimal drying. She gave away portions of her food and her firewood, small amounts she could spare. But the real gift was her practical wisdom. She, who had been cast out as a useless burden, had become the town's most valuable resource. She was no longer just the widow Hale. She was Clara of the Ridge, the woman who understood the cold. The blizzard had crippled the Black Ridge Mining Company. Shafts were flooded, equipment was frozen, and the workforce was sick and demoralized. The disaster was so complete that it drew the attention of the head office in Denver. They dispatched their best man, a senior engineer named Alistair Finch, to assess the damage and develop a plan to prevent a recurrence. Finch was in his late 40s, a serious, methodical man with a degree from a prestigious Eastern university. He arrived in Gideon's Gulch to a scene of chaos and incompetence. He spent his first week interviewing the local superintendent, studying the layout of the town, and inspecting the shoddy construction of the company housing. He quickly concluded that the entire settlement was fundamentally unfit for the realities of a high-altitude winter. He heard stories, whispers at first, then more direct accounts from men like Elias Porter about the woman living up on the ridge. They told him she had built a shelter in a cave and had ridden out the storm in warmth and safety. Finch was a man of science and engineering. He was deeply skeptical of folk tales about miracle shelters. He assumed it was an exaggeration, a crude hovel where a desperate woman had gotten lucky. Still, his professional curiosity was piqued. Accompanied by Mr. Porter, he made the journey up to Widow's Ridge. As they approached, Finch saw the neat plume of smoke rising from the stovepipe, a stark contrast to the haphazard, smoky chimneys in the town below. When Clara opened her door and he stepped inside, his skepticism evaporated, replaced by a profound, professional respect. He did not see a hovel. He saw a masterpiece of vernacular engineering. He ran his hand over the dry stack granite wall, noting the tight fit of the stones and the intelligent use of chinking. He examined the installation of the stove, the way the pipe was sealed to prevent both drafts and fire risk. He looked at the massive, well-organized woodpile and understood immediately that this was the work of a planner, not a scavenger. "Remarkable," he said, his voice quiet. He began to walk the space, talking almost to himself, using the language of his profession. "This isn't a cave. It's a passive solar dwelling. The southern orientation, the enclosed entrance. You've maximized solar gain." He pointed to the limestone ceiling. "And you've leveraged the thermal mass of the rock itself. It absorbs heat during the day and radiates it back all night. That's why you can maintain a stable temperature with such a small stove." He noticed the fissure in the back. "And that's your ventilation. A natural chimney effect. It draws smoke out without creating a significant draft. It's incredibly efficient." He turned to Clara, his expression one of unreserved admiration. "Mrs. Hale, where did you learn to do this?" "My husband taught me to observe how things work," she said simply. "The rest is common sense." Finch shook his head slowly. "This is more than common sense. This is applied science." He looked around the small, warm space again. "The company is planning to build new housing, Mrs. Hale. Proper housing that can withstand these winters. Frankly, we don't know how. We build what works in Denver, and it fails here." He paused, then made his decision. "What you've built here, this is the blueprint. The principles you've used are the solution to our problem. We need your knowledge. The Black Ridge Mining Company would like to offer you a consulting position. We will pay you to help us design the new town." The irony was immense. The company that had declared her worthless was now begging to purchase her wisdom. Her vindication had arrived, not with a lawyer, but with an engineer. Clara accepted the offer. She did not do it for the company, but for the people of Gideon's Gulch, for Sarah and her son, for the old widower, for the families who deserved to be warm. She worked with Alistair Finch through the remainder of the winter, not in an office, but at the kitchen table in Mr. Porter's back room. She drew sketches on rough paper, translating the principles of her shelter into plans for small, sturdy cabins. Her designs were simple and elegant. Each house was to have a primary southern exposure with large windows to capture the winter sun. The north walls were to be thick and windowless, banked with earth for insulation. She specified the use of local stone for foundations and a central hearth, creating a thermal mass at the core of each home. She insisted on smaller, more efficient stoves, properly vented, and she drew up a detailed plan for the management of the town's wood supply, ensuring every family had access to seasoned, dry fuel. Finch translated her practical knowledge into formal blueprints. astonished by her intuitive grasp of thermodynamics and structural integrity. He treated her not as a curiosity, but as a professional peer. A quiet respect grew between them, built on a shared understanding of how the material world worked. The reckoning for the Black Ridge Mining Company was swift and administrative. The local superintendent, whose negligence had been so thoroughly exposed, was dismissed. Mr. Ames, the young clerk who had delivered her eviction notice, was quietly transferred to a desolate outpost in Nevada. The change was not driven by morality, but by Finch's stark report to the Denver office, which concluded that Clara Hale's designs would save the company more in lost productivity and worker retention than they would ever cost to build. It was the cold logic of the ledger, the same logic that had cast her out, that now served to vindicate her. She was paid $500 for her work, a sum that was, to her, a fortune. With the first half of it, she walked into the company land office and, with Mr. Finch as her witness, purchased the deed to a 10-acre plot on the south slope of the mountain. The plot included her limestone alcove. Widow's Ridge was now hers, by law as well as by labor. With the second half, she bought the small, abandoned house next to Porter's General Store, a place to live during the warmer months, a foothold back in the community that had once expelled her. The narrator of these events would note that there was no celebration. The money was collected. The land was hers. The truth of her competence was documented and paid for. But Thomas was still buried in the frozen ground of the town cemetery. The months of crushing labor and solitude were gone, a part of her life she could never reclaim. The scars on her hands had faded to white lines, but they remained. She had not been rescued. She had rescued herself. The final scene takes place the following spring. The snow has retreated to the high peaks, and the valley is green with new aspen leaves. Clara stands at the entrance to her shelter on the ridge. The interior is clean, the stove polished and cool, and a neat stack of kindling sits beside it, ready. She will never abandon this place. It is her fortress, her proof, the source of her new authority. It will always be kept ready. Alistair Finch, who now travels to Gideon's Gulch regularly to oversee the construction of the new town, sometimes walks up to the ridge to sit with her. A quiet companionship is forming, unhurried and based on mutual respect. But that is a secondary story. The primary story is the shelter itself. She was no longer the widow of Thomas Hale, a woman defined by loss. She was Clara of the Ridge, a woman defined by what she had built. The shelter remained, kept ready, a quiet monument to the fact that she had faced the cold, the cruelty, and the calculation, and met them all with her own.